they have to detassel every other row. Otherwise, there's going to be a little sexual activity between these adjacent rows, and that messes up the seeds and the offspring. That's how they have to control it, you see, because they want to preserve the hybridization in a certain way. Now, we've known about this because that's the way the Germans bred a dachshund. You know, they got shorter and shorter legs and longer dogs because these dogs were bred to get after badgers, which means going down a hole. And dachshunds, incidentally, although they're a very gentle dog, when they smell blood and the attack is on, are incredibly vicious. They go right to the end. These dachshunds were bred to do that. Well, my point is that this environment is powerful stuff. But it is no more powerful than what you start with. So, from an Anisa point of view, we have an epigenetic perspective on the heredity environment thing, and we say environment is important, heredity is important, but the real thing is the interaction between the two. And it is in the interaction where we can invest our efforts. And we can also alter this. So we have a lot of powerful things to do on our side. The Jensen research tries to establish the fact that 80% of what you can become is determined hereditarily and 20% is determined by the environment. But I just, for the life of me, cannot understand how they arrived at those figures, even though the studies were, some of them were done carefully, and they were done with twins isolated at birth. You see, if you get identical twins, they then have exactly the same genes. Now, if you take these identical twins and you take one over here and you put him in a foster home that's poor and badly organized and doesn't have very many opportunities, and you take this twin and put it in a home that's filled with opportunities and so on, then you're going to get a difference. And Jensen says you won't get any more than 20%. But you see, how different can an environment be? Well, it can be, we don't have any way of measuring how different it can be. And I feel certain that I could take one of those identical twins, I could wrap him up in a wet gunny sack and keep him there for 30 years, and he's going to be mentally retarded. And I can take the other twin and I can tutor him one-on-one. I'll find him an Aristotle and a Plato to work with him 12 hours a day, and I'm sure we're going to boost him up more than 20%. In fact, I bet you I can make 120 points IQ difference between the two identical twins. Now, it may be that the way we do things now, it might be 20%. But let's suppose Jensen is right, that 20% is all that you can have any effect on. Well, since we say that 79 IQ is on the upper edges of mental retardation, if you add 20 points to it, you get 99. And since we say normal IQ is 90 to 110, we've at least brought the kid into what we consider now to be the normal range. Well, that's quite a lot. If you can take him from a mentally retardation category to normal intelligence, well, I mean, who could ask for more than that? Well, we can, we have, and I think we have the system to do it. Now, when somebody asks you, then the question, well, which do you think is more important, heredity or environment? You would say, both are absolutely essential. But the thing that we concentrate on from an Anisa point of view is the interaction between the two. And of course, we also have say on the environment, as well as the interaction. Don't forget, nutrition is a form of interaction with the environment. the interaction takes the form of eating. You put some of that environment out there inside you. And what you put in, of course, has an effect on what you are too, because you're made up of those things. So we say that Anisa has an epigenetic view of development. Epi means on, genetic means genes. So it's on the genes. In other words, there are effects that can be made on the genes by virtue of the interaction between the environment. In other words, the environment doesn't control everything, the genes don't control everything, but in fact, it's the combination of the qualities of the two as they interact. The 10th question is, what does a theory of development have to say about equalizing educational opportunity? Which we cited as perhaps #1 problem in American education. Well, we have to understand what opportune means, because until we have that understood, we won't know what equal means. Let me say a few things that we used to think it was, but now we realize it isn't. We used to think to equalize educational opportunity meant to provide the same amount of money per pupil. So we say, okay, we're going to have $520 a year per pupil in all the school systems, and that will equalize it. Well, that was somewhat important to have that idea. And you see now the big case in California, which is shaking things up and which I think will eventually put pressure on us, to alter the way in which we organize monetary resources for schools. Will have to be away from property taxes, because if you're in an area where property values are depressed, you don't get much money for schools. In Beverly Hills, you get $1,300 per pupil. In Jackson, Mississippi, you get $379 per pupil. Well, that's not very equal right there. But even if we could do that, we would then say, oh, well, all teachers aren't the same. Some teachers are better than others. A child who has a better teacher is better off than a child who has a lousy teacher. How will we equalize that? Aha, we will certify teachers. And in order to get certified, you'll have to come up to a certain standard. The way to come up to that standard is to accumulate courses. That did have some effect. But now, alas, we found that those courses don't make you into a good teacher. They may be necessary, but they are not sufficient to guarantee that you are a good teacher. Because the certification has to do with the accumulation of courses that don't have any bearing on what you do with a child. So we need a competency-based teacher preparation system where the proof of the pudding is in the doing. And you wouldn't certify a teacher unless you saw that she could actually teach a child. But then you have to understand what teaching is. And that's a big controversy, although tomorrow we will settle the issue. At least we'll tell you one perspective on the issue, and you can decide whether or not whether you think we've settled it or not. So there was certification. Well, then we realized cultures are different, and kids come from different cultures, and the kids that your kids go to school with have an influence on their education. So we thought, well, we better mix everybody up, so we had busing.
Busing and cussing.
Busing and cussing, yes. Well, you know, in Boston, poor old Boston is really having a rough time. And so Judge Garrity, you know, recently divided Boston up into 9 sections. And he assigned a major university in Massachusetts to each one of those sections. And UMass has been assigned to Section 7. So some of the people from the president's office came over to visit the School of Ed and say, well, now what are we going to do there? We have to do something. And so we said, well, what have you got anything to do with it? He said, well, no, we're not going to put any money into it. So I said to Vice President, Mag went with me. We went to see him ourselves. We were invited to come and see him. He said, you know, Boston needs 50 years and $20 million a year. And you're not going to do anything other than that. And the ultimate answer for Boston is to create schools in the depressed areas of such extraordinarily high quality that all the people who left want to move back in. All the white people. And then you won't have to worry about busing anymore. See, as long as you keep terrible schools around, everybody who can afford to move out will. And you will leave behind those who can't afford to move out. And by virtue of the way the society is set up, that's going to be minority groups. So we volunteered to move Anisa lock, stock, and barrel to Boston and set up a demonstration school, second to none in the universe, provided they would give us the money. And you know, we don't want to live in Boston, but we'd be willing to do it if they would give us the resources to demonstrate the efficacy of this model. And the reason it would work so well is because if our theories are right, we would have the capacity to truly equalize educational opportunity for those children. Opportune means to be advantageous, apt, timely. Now, what kind of an experience is therefore going to be opportune for a child? It's going to be one that fits his developmental level on every dimension possible, so that he can develop on all fronts at an optimum rate. That means, in essence, individualizing instruction. But you can't individualize instruction if you don't have a theory of development that will enable you to create experiences that matches the child's developmental level. And we ourselves are not terribly well equipped to match experience with the child's developmental level. That's what the 20 years of research on our drawing boards is all about. We'd be willing to move to Boston and try it out over the next 20 years. But we know enough now to know that we got to do it, and we have a head start over anybody else that I know of in doing it. And I feel certain that if we started with those babies and had them for 15 years, no matter who they were, as long as they didn't have brain damage, they would emerge to be the prominent citizens, the physicians, the engineers, the lawyers, the architects, the educators, the philosophers, the writers, the musicians, and the artists of the future. They would not become the bums and the down and outs, and the liabilities and the mental wrecks and the delinquents and the criminals. They would, in fact, have power over their own destiny and assume a prominent position in the society. So, to equalize opportunity means not to make it the same. That's what people have made the mistake about. They think equal means sameness. But for us, equality means making the experience fit, and that means making it different, not the same. In other words, if a child needs math only 50 minutes a week, then he just gets it 50 minutes a week. But if he needs it 50 minutes a day, then he gets it 50 minutes a day. But if you give only 50 minutes of math a week for everybody, that experience is not equal, because some need it and some don't. Now, we have big arguments with people who think that, by golly, I want my kid to have exactly what her kid has. Well, when you ask for that, you are asking for unequal educational opportunity. That's where the big mistake has been. My little Sarah, who had such one dreadful time learning how to read until school was ruined for her, I mean, going to school in the morning, I had to just kind of yank her out of bed and get her dressed, and there was a hassle every single morning to make her go. And if I'd had any guts, I would have just called up the school system and told them to go soak their heads. And if I could afford it, I would have hired a tutor to look after her, because she's a bright, intelligent, happy, aggressive, vital child. See? But the school did not know how to individualize instruction for that child. They tried to make her do what every other child was doing for the same amount of time, at the same time, in the same way, and it didn't fit her. It was therefore everything but opportune for her. It was not advantageous, timely, or apt. And therefore the school experience was not equal for her, because it was the same. Okay. So if people ask you, how does the Anisa theory of development address the issue of equalizing educational opportunity, that's how it does it. And I tell you, I have looked at all of the literature in equalizing educational opportunity, and I failed to find a convincing analysis unless it goes in this direction. If you find a better way of equalizing educational opportunity, we want you to tell us right away, because we'll shift our point of view on it. But I think it's, at least our detailed analysis over the last 10 years on this issue, and I was heavily implicated in Head Start right at the beginning. In 1965, the first year of Head Start, I went to Washington with the basic Anisa ideas. And I said, what is going to be the theoretical basis for Head Start? How are we going to do it? I said, have we got a system worked out so we know what we're doing? He said, no. I said, well, then give me $1 million and let me work out the system over in a quiet corner of the country. I don't need any publicity. I just want to work it out till I'm sure. And then once it's worked out, everybody can have it. They said, well, how long would it take? I said, well, 5 years. He said, are you kidding? We have to be in business on Monday. I said, but 5 years will go by like that. And at the end of it, you won't know what you did. And if something worked, you won't know why it worked. And if it didn't work, you won't know why it didn't work. And then where will you be? Well, my friends, 10 years has passed by, and they're still exactly where they were then. That's the mindlessness by which the profession, that's the mindlessness of the leadership in the education professions. And they never did find a way to address this problem of equalizing educational opportunity, because they didn't have a theory of development. Now, I'm not down on Head Start, though, you know, because it did a lot for this nation. It revealed the incredible inequalities in just health standards alone. In diet, in general health, the number of kids that got glasses, the number of kids that had their teeth fixed, the number of kids whose ears were ruined and got help, the number of kids that had chronic infections that got cured. I mean, just that alone was quite an enormous achievement. And that's because the actualization of biological potentialities is a much easier thing to manage than the actualization of psychological potentialities. And Head Start did an awful lot to do that. And it dramatized an issue and made people conscious, and so I think it was worth every penny of it. But the tragedy of it was so much more mileage could have gotten out of that money if we knew how to spend it right. Now, Title I spends even more. It spends $1.5 billion a year. And it still doesn't know how to do it. And the research data shows that they don't. That's because they give the money to people to do the same thing that they're doing, which is failing, to do that better. So that we're financing a fancier system of failure, of failing children. What do they do with the Title I money? They carpet the floor, put in better lights. That all helps, of course. You get more tape recorders, language masters, more materials, more junk, more aids, and you try to do what you were doing before, faster and better. But that's the thing that's already claimed by research not to work. I don't know. The stupidity of it is ghastly. It's enough to turn you into a flying rage as a taxpayer. And it's interesting, we were invited down to Washington to talk about Anisa to the Division of Compensatory Education, which is the chief agency in the federal government that is supposed to be equalizing educational opportunity. But that money cannot go into the development of a model or into the training of teachers, even though the Title I literature itself says the most important factor in making a successful Title I classroom is a teacher who knows how to teach those children. Well, now I'm going to come down off I'll take off my robe, and the sermon is over now, and I want to now talk about the Anisa curriculum, because that curriculum has been structured to reflect fully the arrangement of resources and their deployment such that educational opportunities are equalized for children. You know, part of the, I don't know if you've ever seen that enormous study we did on Title I in the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts gets around $30 million a year for Title I. $5 million goes to Boston alone. And in many ways, the Anisa-Model was put together to be a Title I model. Of course, it could be, as you know, it's for all children everywhere. But it speaks most directly to the Title I child, because he comes to the school system with the background that didn't provide him with all of those things that are going to increase the probability of his becoming a competent learner.
Dr. Jordan, what is Title I?
Oh, I'm sorry. Title I of the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965 is for disadvantaged children. It's for children who come from families of low economic means. And of course it includes most of the minority children of the nation. Now, when I was growing up, I would have been in Head Start and I would have been a Title I child. So to be poor doesn't mean you're dumb, although a lot of people think that. It's just that you're dumb if you don't have any opportunities. And if you're poor, the number of opportunities you have are apt to be fewer. So Title I was designed to change all that and to provide opportunities for the kid. But the thing is, it didn't provide opportunities that fitted him. It wasn't apt, it wasn't timely, and therefore it hadn't worked very well. So we did that study, and much of what we discovered in that detailed study, I think, was the most definitive Title I study ever done in the country. Incidentally, they're doing another one now. National Institutes of Education has allocated $5 million to study Title I programs.
Well, let's start it.
You see, and I said, you know, we've already studied it to death, but nobody has it. Before you study something, you have to have an idea what it is you're going to look for. And these guys that study it don't even know what to look for. We've already looked at it and found out what was there. It would be much better if they would give us the $5 million and let us get on with it. But somehow there's just no way of talking people into that. Well, on to curriculum. Curriculum as a separate field has only been around for about 50 years. And yet it's been a concern from the time of Plato. Most people think a curriculum is simply the course that you take. And by the course that you take, they mean the books that you read and the tests that you take and the material that you have to cover. So that the view of curriculum for most people has to do with the body of information that's going to get covered. and that you want the child to learn, to memorize. However, since information is only part of the picture in becoming a competent learner, process being the other part, the Anisa curriculum redresses that imbalance in traditional systems. After 50 years of work in curriculum, we have no comprehensive curriculum theory in this country, outside of Anisa, that I know of, and we've looked at them all. There's an awful lot of words written about them. As Mag will tell you, she's read a stack of books this high on it. They all talk about what a curriculum theory ought to do, but they never ever got around to making one. And we wondered, well, why is that? And I think we found the answer. These curriculum people are not developmental psychologists. And we don't see any way of having a comprehensive curriculum theory organized in a vacuum. It must be a derivative theory from a theory of development. Precisely because a curriculum, which must in some way represent experience, is presumed to have some effect on the development of the child. And therefore, if you don't understand development, there is no way you can understand curriculum. Therefore, until you have a comprehensive theory of development, you cannot have a comprehensive theory of curriculum. And the same goes for a comprehensive theory of pedagogy. Both pedagogy and curriculum, as theories, must necessarily be derivative. They cannot exist in a vacuum by themselves. And the people who try to develop teaching theories try to do it in a vacuum, just like those who try to develop curriculum theories try to do it in a vacuum. And you can't manage that. So, we have our theory of development. And from that, we've organized this theory of curriculum. We say that a curriculum is made up of two sets of goals. A, dealing with process, and B, dealing with content. In other words, a curriculum ought to specify what you want to accomplish educationally. That's the first thing you must do. Now, Anisa presents a large number of process and content goals, and any school system can select which ones it wants. And in many cases, when you get right down to it, you are generating curriculum on the spot. When I add the next part to this, you'll see what I mean by that. There is only one way in which it is dangerous for people to randomly select the goals they may want. And that is if the content or process depends upon sequential organization in order to get that hierarchical structuring going, then we do have some advice to give about people about which ones have to be in there. And if you don't have it in there, then we would predict you don't get hierarchical organization, and therefore you don't have the kid put together intellectually, cognitively, affectively, volitionally, and so on in the best way possible. But there's a lot of leeway, particularly in content, because content, there's just no end of information to be used. And in any case, you will want to use the information that connects you with other people who share the same culture you do. Therefore, if you're going to take Anisa to Mexico, obviously the language is not going to be English, it's going to be Spanish. And much of the content, the information about the world in which they live, is going to be Mexican, and not Connecticut. What's the adjective for Connecticut? Do you have Connecticut? No. Does Connecticut not turn into an adjective ever? Huh? No? Connecticut culture. I guess it's just, you just use the word the way it is. It doesn't have any inflection that turns it into an adjective. So this is one thing. And the second thing that the curriculum is the interactions with particular environments that enables the child to accomplish those goals. So these are, the curriculum is abstract statements, namely a definition of your purpose. You see purpose as final cause. Those purposes cause, finally, in a final sense, what you do. And now if you haven't got this clear, this won't have any coherent structure. There is no substitute for knowing what you're trying to accomplish.
Would you say that second thing again? It's the interactions
with particular environments,
with the environment
which are necessary to achieve those goals.
Okay.
Now you will see that because the translation of potentiality into actuality depends on interaction with the environment, the theory of teaching, or the theory of pedagogy, is taken basically from that proposition in the theory of development. If this is true, namely that this process of translating potentiality into actuality is sustained by interaction with the environment, then teaching must mean arranging environments and guiding the child's interaction with it for the purpose of actualizing a given potentiality. So to train a teacher means to give her the body of information that enables her or him to understand it, and then provide and experience interactions with environments so that they are able to try it out. Let that theory guide practice and see the consequences. And when it happens, and when it begins to happen, and it takes a long time, then a teacher is liberated. Every time we have trained a teacher to work in the ESA system, and it takes, you don't do it in 6 months. Once the person is into that, they are now freed from the recipes because they're master chefs. And now they just order whatever groceries they want and whatever they can get, they can do the best thing with. No matter what kids they get and what supplies they get and what environment they have, within those constraints they can put together the best educational experience for every single child. Carry him forward at the maximum rate. And of course it makes the teacher happier because she's not uptight about having to get a certain paper with a certain recipe in it. She can just, what she has in her head, what she needs to set up the experience for the child. Now, of course, the methods courses in universities are not entirely useless. They give you some ideas of things to do, and a lot of those things will be all right. But if you don't have the theory, you won't know how to modify those things to make them fit the child. That's the problem. And also, you may not be able to order exactly what it was you had in the methods course in the university. You may not get the same text or whatever, you see. And of course, being a good teacher, as we will see later, means having known all this, you now have a way of assessing materials to be used. And you can order things better. A lot of teachers order a lot of stuff and they don't use it. The cupboards are just filled with things that don't get used. Now, this one is the most critical because these interactions with these arranged environments depend upon the application of the body of theory. And this is how the theory of teaching overlaps with the theory of curriculum, because the theory of teaching defines teaching as arranging environments and guiding interaction. So you have the teaching theory overlapping with the curriculum theory, and the way it overlaps is in this area right here. In other words, once you have a specific objective in mind, say a certain process, and I'm going to go through these processes in more detail after the coffee break, so you get an idea of what they all are, and then suggest the organization of content. And then this afternoon, I want you to have some exercises in doing some things, because until you make your minds think in this way and direct it to hypothetical experiences and ultimate real experiences, then all of this will just pass without having any consequence. So you have to try it on for size. So we're going to have some experiences in doing that. Once you know a certain objective or a certain content, then that will give you a key as to what kind of environments are to be arranged in what ways, and how to guide the child's interaction with it to accomplish that objective. Keep in mind that a particular objective may in fact be chosen by the child and not the teacher, because we want the child to become independent. He'll never become independent if he isn't able to determine his own purposes part of the time. Now, in many cases, as you see when we discuss the theory of teaching, it would be irresponsible for a teacher to assume that a child is able to determine his own goals educationally all the time. There will be some who would be playing basketball 16 hours a day, if that were the case. So you have to help structure the situation. And you might say to the child, you have to do some math today, but you can choose when you'll do it. In other words, we always like to have some aspect of every experience include an option where the child exercises his own volition, choice, and decision making. But he can't have absolute choice all the time. In some cases, during part of the day, he should be allowed to decide what he's going to do and when he's going to do it and how he's going to do it and who he's going to do it with and what he's going to do it with. But you can't have the old ego like that, or you'd kind of have pandemonium. On the other hand, if you're individualizing instruction, you must have the help of the child to do it. And that help comes primarily in the form of his revealing his developmental level by virtue of the choices he makes of things to do. Because that is one cue that you can't ignore. And that's the reason why you've got to have those options in there. The options chosen are data for the teacher to use in assessing developmental levels, and if you don't make the choice possible, then you won't get the information, which means you won't be able to individualize the instruction because you won't be in touch with the child's developmental level. Okay, when we come back from coffee then, I want to break these processes down so you get more of a concrete notion of what the specific goals are and indicate the organization of the content area of the curriculum, and that will then provide us the body of information we're working with this afternoon. Okay. The first job, I think now, of gaining a further understanding about the Anisa theory of curriculum is to explore in greater depth the nature of these goals. We said there were two kinds of goals, process and content. Let me talk a little bit now about the process goals. We've already broken those goals down into 5 categories that are the same as the categories of potentialities. In other words, the process goals are organized around the classification of potentialities, and as you will see, the content goals are organized around the classification of environments. This provides the organizational scheme for understanding the nature of these goals. So, the processes that are going to be a part of the curriculum, the process curriculum, concern psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, volitional. And I think almost all of you have read enough of the Anisa literature to get a sense about that. But maybe a few comments would be in order to set the stage for sensing the scope. It would be useful as a beginning to that to make some statements about process itself, because this is one of those key words that has gotten everybody into trouble. And a lot of educators talk about process and content, and their definitions of process are so ambiguous and vague that they're not very useful. And we've had a struggle to make our definition clear enough for it to be useful. As I indicated before, at the end of our 6 weeks 2 years ago at UMass, it finally came to light that at the end of that 6 weeks, almost everybody had misunderstood what we meant by process. They thought that we meant by process the experience the child went through. In other words, if you're going to have him build a stack of blocks of different sizes to seriate them, because you wanted him to learn the process of seriation, that what we meant was putting those blocks together, starting with the biggest one first, going up to the small one. That is not what we mean by process, although you could call that a process in layman's terms. After all, a process is simply a sequence of things that starts here and ends there, and includes everything that goes on in between. That activity of arranging those blocks in a certain order is what we call the interaction part of the curriculum. And that interaction is designed to help the child internalize an operation, a mental operation that we are calling a process. So these process goals all refer to getting certain structural changes taking place inside the child's head that enables him then to behave in a certain way that he wouldn't be able to behave otherwise. So all these processes we're talking about are things that go on inside the child's head. Presumably, there are structural changes in the tissues of the brain, the actual cells, and the way they function when you learn something. Now, those are the things we can't see, and that's why we have to have a theory about them. Now, the only way you would know whether or not a child had acquired one of these processes is to infer it from a pattern of behavior that is observable. That's why the theory business is a little complicated, because what you're looking for you can't see, and therefore its existence must be inferred from something you can see. Now, this will become clearer anyway, as we proceed. The psychomotor area in broad general terms of the curriculum. The objectives specified there, when they are achieved, will make the child have psychomotor competence. And he will have mastered those processes which we think underlies learning competence in that area. In other words, he will have the conscious ability to differentiate, integrate, and generalize the movement of his muscles in a way to accomplish any given purpose. And it will be conscious. I'm very interested in the way my own children, for instance, are learning to play the piano, because that involves coordinating very specialized, refined movements of a variety of muscles. The eye muscles to follow the music, the fingers to play the keys, the feet to pedal the pedal. And I have the thesis that most children find learning how to play the violin and the piano an extraordinary trial, because the child does not have the learning competence, or is not given the learning competence to learn how to play the piano. He's just taught how to play the piano. And one thing he is never taught by teachers is how to practice it. You go to the piano lesson, the teacher assigns these 6 pieces, and you go home and rehearse an extraordinary number of mistakes. You come back, having internalized them, and the teacher says, no, this is not right, no, that's not right, do this over the wrong finger, the wrong wrist movement, this, that, everything else. It's very demoralizing. And now when you go back to the next lesson, you have to try to undo all those things that you learned wrong. And because she hasn't bothered to teach you how to practice again, you now learn a whole lot of other things, new things, wrong. So I got the idea a number of years ago that when you teach a child how to play the piano, the first thing you want to do is to teach him how to practice. That would be very similar to the idea of teaching a child how to learn, so that whenever he wanted to learn anything, he would be better at it than if he didn't know how to learn. So I did a little experiment. This is why I lived in Germany. And I got myself a group, a very small sample of pupils. But I didn't let them practice without me there for the initial stages of their learning how. We started from scratch. And they loved it, because children hate to practice alone. They love practicing with somebody they like. And the reason it turns out they don't like to practice alone is that they can tell when they make a mistake, but they are not taught what to do when they make the mistake. And that's demoralizing, and nobody likes to hang in there if they're doing something that's demoralizing. So I thought to myself, if you could teach piano to children in such a way that they never were allowed to internalize mistakes badly, in a very deep way, that they could learn to play the piano very quickly. And the evidence for this would be that within 9 months, they could all be giving a little recital and feeling very comfortable about it. So I set as my objective, as evidence for having achieved the objective, or demonstrating the thesis, that within 9 months, all these pupils would participate in a recital, and they would play as well as children who've been playing 2 or 3 years that I've had experience with before. And we pulled it off. But it means that you have to be with the child every day to practice with him. That's expensive. But then you make 6 times the progress within the same amount of time. So you know it's worth paying more. It's not, and I wasn't charging outrageous rates, because I was interested in trying something out. Now, we need to do the same kind of thing with our children, and you'll see when we discuss pedagogy, one of the important things in guiding interaction is the analysis of errors. Otherwise, you won't know how to change the guidance you're giving. Now, in the case of teaching these children how to play the piano, I simply made sure that they were not, of course they made mistakes, but I didn't allow them to repeat them and internalize them. The minute a mistake was made, it was done over and done right, and then it was done right 18 times, and then that took precedence over the way it was done wrong, and they don't do it wrong anymore. See? And you go slowly, because you have to see what the differentiated elements are. And it takes repetition to get it all hooked up, integrated in the right way. So that's the way you break something down in such a way that children are less likely to make mistakes, and then if you're there giving guidance, you can keep them from rehearsing them. See, everybody will make mistakes. The dreadful thing is to be left alone and neglected for such long periods of time that the mistaken way of doing something then becomes a part of you. Because now, to unlearn it is so difficult. And you know, you never really do forget the wrong way. That's just now stored in your memory. All you have to do is now, as you will see in the memory seminar, when you've learned something wrong, memorized it wrong, you now have to memorize it right. But both are stored in the memory, the wrong way and the right way. And now you have to remember which one was wrong and which one was right. So that has to be stored in the memory. Now to go back and sort it all out is very costly from a psychological point of view. To learn all the wrong ways, and then to have to learn all the right ways, and then have to remember as well which ones are right and which ones are wrong. Now you all, I know, have difficulty spelling certain words that you learned the wrong way. And you probably looked up the right way 100 times in the dictionary. But you now, in trying to remember which is right and which is wrong, you even stored that wrong. So you have stored in your memory that this is the right way and the wrong way, and that this way is both the right way and the wrong way, and so when you come to write the word, you have to look it up in the dictionary because you have both words stored, but you both have them tagged as right and wrong. And that makes you very unsure. It is possible to take a lot of that out of the teaching and educational experience so that children learn it right the first time around. But more importantly is for them to understand what makes something right and what makes something wrong so that they come to analyze their own errors. And as you'll see, the process curriculum is set up to help identify errors in itself as well as errors in the content curriculum. So this model is designed not to be the passive transmitter of the status quo, culturally speaking. It is designed to function as the benevolent transformer of the culture in which it is surviving. Don't you think it's a dreadful thing that business out there ought to be the chief change agent of our society, whereas our schools and universities just sit and pass the same stuff along? No, we think that the educational enterprise of a society ought to be the locus of the generation of new knowledge and of the place from which it is disseminated. I was really shocked to find 1968, when I worked on the National Planning Commission for the Education Professions Development Act, which was passed in 1967, Congress had allocated $1.5 billion to take a good long look at what was ailing American education in terms of the way we were training the professional people that staff our educational institutions, and was prepared to launch a major inquiry into that and to find new ways of training educational personnel. You may have had money here with EPDA, I don't know. But Commissioner Howe appointed a National Planning Commission, was chaired by Dwight Allen, and I was appointed to that commission. That's how I got to know Dwight, and that's how come I went to UMass from Indiana. But I was shocked when we started reviewing educators' perspectives on the function of educational institutions, and I was shocked to find that within the American educational tradition, It is believed that the school is not the place to teach a value or to challenge a value. Well, that to teach a value, yes, but to teach it unexamined. In other words, obviously the schools are designed to pass on the values of the culture, otherwise it all fall to pieces. You can't, the way you do something teaches a value. You can't help it. And you'll see in the way we define value why this is inevitably the case. But to expect children to take them on without examining them and to make them uncritical in the way they approach things is to make them blind. It is to make them superstitious, and it is to make them afraid of new information. Well, if you're afraid of new information and you're nervous about ever having the truth, and you don't want the facts because they'll confuse you or they'll upset what you believed before, this is bad news. This is the way to obsolescence. So our system is designed to enable children to sense when things won't get integrated right because there is error involved. Now, when I was teaching Sarah the piano and looking at it very much from a psychomotor point of view, it was very helpful to analyze what troubles she was having because she wasn't differentiating certain muscles to move in certain ways, or she couldn't get them integrated. Just this Anisa analytical framework itself was so helpful, and of course she's being taught by somebody else. But if I had a chance to teach that children and teach my own child and do it the way I did on this sample of children, I would rehearse with her every day. I would not let her rehearse by herself for one whole year, and I would not allow her to internalize errors. As it is now, of course, I'm not there a lot of the time. She has to practice, and she's just internalized all kinds of errors. And the incredible confusion that comes because we will not assess the imminence of the child. They will not sample where they are developmentally, both from a content point of view and from a process point of view. Content imminence simply means, what do they know? What information do they have stored about the world in which they live? And to do that enables you to make the opportunity right there and keep the child right on the cutting edge in a wonderful way. Let me give you an example. You know, you have the music staff. And you have, say, and so on. You read from left to right, and that involves moving the eyes from left to right. But this, usually this on the piano, this represents the right hand. And Sarah would see this sequence of notes and she might play them down. Let's just say, instead of going da-da-da-da-dum, she would go da-da-da-da-dum. I'd say, darling, can you see that these notes are going up? She'd say, yes. I'd say, well, then why don't you make them go up down here on the keyboard? Well, there was this kind of blank glaze. You know, when something's not connecting, there's sort of a glaze that comes over. So she tried. And so I did it, and I did it up on the keyboard, and then she just imitated what I did. But I somehow realized I wasn't getting through. And so I decided to probe to find out, because it just bugs me if I'm not being understood. It's one thing I can't stand. I've got to be understood, at least on some level. And so I just probed until the child was practically in tears. And finally, in exasperation, the point got cleared. She said, if you want it to go up, then you have to put something under this leg of the piano. So you see, up for her is possible here because she can see that these are higher from the floor than this. But the piano keyboard is flat. And it doesn't go up or down. It is just there. So she just exasperated. She said, if you want these notes to go up, then put something under this leg of the piano. And of course that would mean these notes would go down. Well, it just occurred to me, you see, the child was not differentiating and applying the notion of upness and downness. She was looking at upness totally in spatial terms, and not in terms of pitches determined by higher and lower frequencies, which is another meaning to up and down, higher and lower. You know what I found another thing? When I took the music off the stand and put it flat, and she wasn't so sure whether the notes went up or not. Set it up, and they definitely go up. Put them down, well, they're just flat again, you see. Well, once I realized this child is looking at this thing in spatial terms only, and she is not making a differentiation between the meanings of upness and downness and higher and lower, then the whole thing got resolved. I must have identified 60 or 70 of those kinds of hang-ups in this child, which when they were clarified, she just would be released from the confusion and the bind, you see. Another one was, this would be 1, and this might be 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. In piano, thumb is 1, this is 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I know that most people don't call this the first finger. They call this the first finger. But in piano, thumb is 1. But you see, here's the bar line, and this is beat 1. So I'm calling out the numbers of the beats. I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and she is looking at these numbers, which are the fingers. Well, this poor child was going like this, and I said, why are you jumping around like this? She said, well, you're saying 3. I said, well, it's the third beat. She thought these numbers referred to, she didn't know, she kept jumping back and forth between beats and fingers. Because we're using numbers to refer to all of these things at the same time. And then there are letters here too, you know, this is F, this is B, C, D. So I said, play the second finger on C on the third beat, for heaven's sakes. Well, that's too much to process, right? Well, you can see how a child could be just faced with an impenetrable sea of confusion of just the way these things are symbolically represented. If you don't differentiate, break it down, rehearse those differentiations, make sure they're stored in the right way, and then slowly make the connections in the head, and slowly make the connections with those symbolic connections in the head with what you do with your fingers. And if you do it sequentially, and if you do it right, you build up a hierarchy of structure in the mind that it enables the child to play. But even now, you see, she's got the problem of the tremendous confusion of having associated so many things. You have to go back and now remember which is which. But the wrong thing is always there. You don't forget what you knew was wrong, that you learned was wrong. It's stored in there too, and it takes up space, presumably. So one of our main ideas is to turn every error into a new learning experience, which classifies the line of thought is absolutely crystal clear and cutting. And so she's very critical of teachers who can't explain things. And we got her report card back, and she's a loving child. Everybody really likes her. And she knows how to move in and help a child that's having trouble. She's very helpful. But in her little report card at the end of the year, the music teacher said, the year was wonderful except for a 3-day strike. That's went on. So we called her in and asked her to explain the nature of this strike. Well, she went on strike all right. And she simply refused to participate in the activity until the teacher had delivered on a certain promise that was made. And because she's a sort of child that for whom expectations are a great source of motivation. And if you build the expectation and then you don't deliver on it, she goes on strike. That's why I'm very careful to make a promise, because she always says to me, if I say I'll do something, she says, is that a maybe or is that a real promise? I said, well, no, that's just a maybe. She said, well, I don't like that because your maybes always turn out to be no. She said, you have 3 answers, yes, no, and maybe, but there are only really 2 answers because no's and maybes are the same. I mean, she really just, pushes like this. So I think she's going to be a lawyer. She loves the idea of a contract, and she's very sensitive about what constitutes breaking that contract. Well, working with my own children on a lot of these things has made it clear to me that the analysis of a learning problem always boils down to finding out on what dimension did the child fail to differentiate, integrate, or generalize. And if there are conflicts between different parts, these conflicts will be there because there has been an erroneous generalization, or there is a missing integration, or 2 things are regarded as the same when in fact they are different, which means there was a failure of differentiation. So we're going to talk about, in teaching, the analysis of error tomorrow, and we'll get into that just a little bit more. But I think you can begin to see the richness of the possibilities and the incredible power and effectiveness of a teacher who brings to bear on every situation this entire body of theory. That person is going to be able to help that child in so many more ways per unit time than somebody who just says, this kid isn't getting it, but I don't know why she's not getting it, and then ask her to do the same thing over in the same way under the same circumstances, which conceivably be the right thing to do, but you ought to have a reason for doing it that way. After all, repetition is worth something. Well, the overarching objective of this part of the curriculum is to make the child competent from a psychomotor point of view, and to give him the foundations on which at some later time he could himself decide to become more competent in that area because he knows how to learn in terms of moving the muscles. Now, the last 3 days of the 2-week session is going to be a psychomotor workshop. I don't know how many of you are signed up to come, but we are going to present to you then, or those who attended, a wonderful document, which I'm staying up all night these days to edit, which is a complete analytical framework for the development of psychomotor competence for young children. As you know, we've had a visiting scholar with us this whole last semester, Dr. Patricia Tanner from the University of South Florida. She's known about Anisa for several years, and It's a tribute to her and a tribute to us that she would take off and at her own expense come up to work with us for one whole semester. That she considered it a time for professional mind stretching to be with the Anisa team. And we found, on the other hand, that she has made an extraordinary contribution because she had terrific experience and knowledge. And when it all got organized and came out through the Anisa theoretical framework, there is enough in that document to keep any teacher busy for 30 years in thinking up things for children to do to increase their psychomotor competence. In other words, interaction things to do to make them competent from that point of view. Now, the reason there is such emphasis in the psychomotor domain lies in one of the basic propositions of the theory of development, namely that the translation of potentiality into actuality depends on interaction with the environment, and the main way you interact with the environment is to move your muscles. And don't forget, all of these other potentialities are actualized by moving through the interacting with the environment, and therefore how well you develop your mind and your perception and your feelings and your volition is tied in inextricably with psychomotor development. That's why I think a quick way to retard a child who is born potentially with a very high IQ is to wrap him in a wet gunny sack and just leave him there for 30 years. And I can guarantee you he's going to be retarded, because you won't let him interact with anything but a wet gunny sack. And if you put him in the dark so he can't see anything, and you soundproof the room, in a very short space of time, you will have a babbling idiot that won't grow and develop at all. So the psychomotor area is of very critical importance. As you know, we just came from a 3-day workshop out in Denver, out in Granby, Colorado, in the wonderful Rockies, where 600 to 700 Montessorians gathered for their national conference, which was largely based on Anisa. And J. McVicker Hunt was there, the great developmental psychologist from the University of Illinois. And he's been doing some work in a Tehran orphanage, where the conditions are very sanitary and the babies are looked after very well, in the sense that they are always changed when they're wet or soiled, and they're fed reasonably well. And the lighting is good and the temperature is right and it's clean. But all these babies spend day after day in a little crib. They are 1 to 2 years late in starting to walk and to talk, because the psychomotor possibilities are so limited. So there is no doubt that this general interaction with the environment and moving through it has implications for all other parts of development. They are slowed up in their affective development. Their growth generally is stunted because they have lower appetites because of not being able to bounce around enough. And there are many cases of children not being stroked and mothered and stimulated and moved around enough that they develop a condition called marasmus, which is simply kind of giving up. And some of these babies just kind of fade away, and some of them actually just die. And you can't find any definite organic cause. Just because if they're not developing even a little tiny bit, then the reversal of not developing is slowly dying. And if you don't develop at all, you begin to go in the opposite direction, and eventually it results in just the organism, the viability of the organism being snuffed out. How come you're smiling, Dottie?
Well, because of the discussion we had in an Albert Ellis group about just this.
What did he say?
Erasmus. Oh, apparently, yeah, his theory, someone who's written, either Ellis, I can't quote the source right now, says that the studies that Renee Spitz did are
Oh,
incorrect.
yes. Oh, that they're incorrect.
Yeah, right, and that's why I was smiling, because we had a big discussion
Yes.
about it.
There is no
Well,
such
I
thing
have-
as mesmerism.
There is no...
He doesn't believe it exists.
No,
He thinks it's other-
mesmerism is something else.
Yeah, Erasmus.
Erasmus, yes. Well, it may be something else. But so far as the information about restricted movement in environment and its effect on development is concerned, whether it goes to that extreme condition and you give it that name and babies do die, there's a lot of records of that happening. Something else may have happened as well. I don't know. But the evidence that the restricted movement possibilities over long periods of time and no stimulation by interacting with a rich environment is concerned, the evidence on that is in. It suppresses the rate of the actualization of potential. What is the alternative interpretation of the Spitz studies?
I was arguing your point of view, actually.
Yes. Did he say what it was? Because
I
I've been slightly skeptical about it myself, going that far.
I can find out and tell you tomorrow. Okay?
Yeah.
I'll call them.
You see, I suspect in some of those cases the baby may have also been beaten.
Yeah.
And that adds another dimension, because if a child just gets beaten for every time he tries something, cries or anything, then eventually the child just sits there like a vegetable and can't move and won't move, and then could eventually develop a lowered resistance to disease, and you could get a chronic infection, and then everything is on the skids, and then pretty soon you just kind of die.
Dan, what was McVicker Hunt doing in that orphanage? Was he trying to correct the situation?
Yes, he was collecting data. He was trying to find a way of stimulating the speech development of children, because he believes that the onset of speech and consolidating it at the optimum rate is critical to the intellectual and cognitive development of the children. And he wanted a sample where it was known that the speech started slowly, and therefore if he could, and he did find a way of speeding it up. And of course, the way he did it was to increase the level of interaction with different environments. And he wouldn't see it this way necessarily because he doesn't know our theory, but I'll tell you what he did. For 15 minutes a day, one of the aides in the orphanage had to hold the child up and look in his eyes, and when the child made a sound, the adult had to imitate the same sound. So if the baby said goo, the aide said goo. If the baby said ba 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 ba, the aide would say ba 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 ba. And immediately what that did to the child, the minute the child realized that he could get this other person to say this, he just went crazy. He would say goo goo ba ba da da, just say the whole thing. And of course, our thesis would predict that. Because if the child sensed that he could have an effect on the environment, even though it was a piece of the human environment, namely the aide that worked in the orphanage, if you can say goo to an aide, and that causes the aide to say goo, you are being effective. You are having effects on the environment. This is an expression of your effectiveness. Therefore, it's highly motivating. And so you repeat that because it makes you feel good. So you say goo again. And finally, you say it all the time. So the minute the aide comes, you just start. And of course, this got the kid speaking. Then, after that phase was over, the aide would introduce a new sound. The baby would say ga 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 ga, and the aide would say ga 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 boo. Well, now this is introducing a differentiation. And what they found is the child would imitate. This made the aide feel good because now the aide feels she's having an effect on the environment, right? So you get this thing going, there would be no end of it, you see. And they found that they could really initiate, just by 15 minutes a day, And of course, the kids loved the attention. That was the best part of the day for them, stuck in those cribs. Now, of course, if it were in an Anisa orphanage, we'd have them out of those cribs in a minute. They would be moving around and doing all kinds of things, you see, but they had so many babies that it's easy for babies to get stepped on. If you got 500 babies in a small room, you got to have little fences around them. Otherwise, you'd just be, picking your steps all over the place, and you'll just be stepping on babies, wall-to-wall babies. And but even so, you just shouldn't set up an orphanage that way. Well, yes.
This is a little off the track, but I was just wondering if you had any more information on that baby you told us about last year, the one that was.
Yes, that little baby is still alive. And that mother was given by the city in which she lives the Mother of the Year award. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce and the citizens of that community were so impressed by this mother that they created this award and gave it to her. This is a child that has what did I say it was? Metachromatic muscular dystrophy.
Leukodystrophy.
Oh,
Metachromatic
dystrophy, yes. Metachromatic leukodystrophy.
It was a year ago. Didn't you just direct them
We
to
just
the-
had the word.
Oh, yeah, we found out what it was. It does have a name, but it's
the day-
incurable. They don't know what to do with it.
The day that you told us about it was the day that this baby was going to be diagnosed by your friend.
That's right.
And so you didn't know what the baby had at the time.
Yeah, well, I found out later what it was, and I think I told you. And it was metachromatic leukodystrophy.
Now, is she just lying and still just...
That's right.
She's no change in her condition?
It's an inborn error of metabolism in which at about 9 months the child can no longer synthesize protein. Well, just a little tiny bit. And so the bones, which are putting together calcium, get longer, but the flesh on them isn't built up. And so as the child gets longer, you have less, everything has to get stretched. And so this child looks about this long now, can't move because there's no muscles to move anything. It's just like a little skeleton covered with bones. Literally. You just couldn't believe it. And of course, since there are no muscles to move anything, the child cannot even have a bowel movement. Or swallow. The child just barely has strength enough to swallow. Just kind of gravity goes down. And the mother has to reach into the bowels and clean the child out 4 or 5 times a day. And of course the child can't move. She's just so weak. And we were so touched because these babies usually die by a year and a half. And this child is now going on 7. Is that right, Maggie? Yes. And they say that she's just living on pure spirit, this child, because of the incredible love of this mother, who does not complain, who looks cheerful, who takes that baby around. And she had her at a conference. That's where we met her, and I couldn't believe it. I thought the physicians that they had this child with weren't giving any nutritional advice and so on. Well, I must say I was very touched because they were thinking of adopting another baby. And so they asked this child, who can't speak because there's not enough energy to move the muscles, said to the child, who can incidentally understand things, that's the amazing thing, said that we're thinking of getting a new brother or sister, and would you like one? And if you'd like one, close your eyes for a little while and then open them. And if you wouldn't want it, our brother, just leave them open. And the little girl closed her eyes, kept them closed for a while, then opened them up. And I remember when she was sitting on the couch there, she's just wrapped in a blanket, looking just like a little skeleton. Part of her hair is falling out. She goes into convulsions, and so the child is on Valium, and Valium is one of those drugs that eventually erodes away the system. But it's the best anticonvulsant we know of. And there was a discussion going on, and they were talking about human relations and so on. and this little bony hand came out from underneath the blanket. He went over and grabbed the mother's finger, just like this. And the child just seemed kind of so aware, the eyes moved very slowly, aware of things going on. And so, in spite of the fact that genetically now the child has no muscles to move and everything, this mother keeps that child interacting with a supporting and loving environment. And there has been cognitive and affective and perceptual development. And even volitional development, because the effort it takes that little child to just move a little hand out is unbelievable. I mean, the child looks like she's totally paralyzed because she can't move because there's no muscle to do the moving, because she can't synthesize the protein to make the muscle. She's got all the muscles that were there when she was 9 months old, but they've been stretched because the bones got bigger, you see. And so, of course, they can't chew anything because she can't move her jaws. So everything's had to be... Did she put a tube through her nose, Meg? She put a tube through the nose, which goes down to the stomach. So every meal she has to put that tube in, down to the stomach, and then just pour the fluid in the tube. Well, I tell you. But I saw this girl a year later, just a few months ago, as a matter of fact. And I just met her briefly somewhere by accident. And I said, "Joanne, how are you?" And she said she was fine. And she told me that, what is the little child's name? I've forgotten now. Shireen. She said, "You know, Shireen is still alive." She said she's an inch longer. So there's still growth there going on that one level. I mean, when you see things like that, it's just absolutely miraculous. Well, there are still differentiation and integrations going on in every other way possible. That's exactly what's happening. And it will go on, I suspect, as long as it is possible. But this mother is providing the richest possible environment and best possible interactions to keep that going. Now, so much for the psychomotor part of the curriculum. There is no way that I can overemphasize the fact that these things are never separated very clearly in the life of a child. A child is all of a piece. We have broken this down for the sake of achieving conceptual clarity on the part of teachers, so that we kind of know what we're doing, we know what our objectives are. It will be impossible for you to pursue an objective up here that won't involve the volition of the child, that won't involve his feelings about what he's doing, that won't involve some thinking about what he's doing, and that involves looking around or feeling or touching or seeing or hearing or tasting or something else. You will not be able to hold 20 million objectives in your mind while you're doing something. You should just be aware that every time you do something, more than one objective is being pursued. And you may have in your mind 2 or 3 at once that are being pursued, and that's okay. The idea is that some of these are very important, and they are worth singling out and organizing an experience to achieve those objectives alone, and then there will be some unanticipated objectives achieved in the process, and that's all just gravy. That's extra, and you should be thankful for it. And in fact, this is one of the things that makes evaluation of the Anisa-Model most difficult. As Ron Hamilton was telling me, he said there are so many unintended, incidental, unanticipated benefits that we aren't collecting data on. And in some cases you might not even know what they are, but you just, as one human being to another, you intuit them. But that's never going to attract $1 million. You've got to do more than just intuit the success. You have to actually collect the hard data. And that's what we want to get set up to do at some time. Perception, perceptual competence, then, is the overall objective of this part of the curriculum. And that competence rests ultimately on being able to integrate, to differentiate, integrate, and generalize sensory input. The question is then, what kind of interactions are needed with what kinds of environments to do that? Well, where vision is concerned, which is one modality of perception, we know that light reflects off things and brings with it the possibility of differentiating that experience on a variety of levels. One would be hue, which has to do with finding out the different frequencies of the light waves. The eye can distinguish with training somewhere between 7 to 14 million different colors. Now, we lump a whole lot of them together and call it blue. We lump a whole lot of others together, several million together, and call it red. We lump another whole batch together and call it yellow. But there are gradations. There is an enormous spectrum of electromagnetic waves, ranging from very tiny short ones that are just, you know, a billionth of an inch long, to waves at this end that are 32 miles long. And these are the radio waves, that are the electromagnetic waves that are used in long wave radio broadcasting. Then there are some that are 16, which is used in shortwave radio broadcasting. Down here, there is a little tiny bit of the spectrum that is sensitive, that the human eye is sensitive to. This ranges from infrared to ultraviolet, which is a little tiny bit in there of that whole spectrum. Now, it's conceivable that bats or hawks or owls may have eyes that translate, that have other colors beyond this spectrum right here. It could be even the human beings do, but it's doubtful. But it's interesting that we should have an organ that would be receptive to electromagnetic waves just in that spectrum. These are, I don't know what they are, 520 millimicrons to, I don't know, maybe there's a physicist here, I can't remember what they are now. But it's just a tiny bit. So what did we do? We developed instruments to measure these and these. So we know they exist, but we can't see them. We have an instrument that is sensitive to them, and the instrument moves the dial, and we can see the dial move. And that gets at the same information. But seeing this green is getting the information directly, because what happens is that from this light source are waves of every length. This material is such that all the wavelengths not green are absorbed, and only the green ones bounce back into my eye. And they set up a certain chemical reaction which goes back here, and that particular kind of chemical reaction and impulse is subjectively translated into greenness. Now, when the child comes out of the womb, the retina has never experienced light. And as William James hypothesizes, it must be a booming, buzzing, what's the other word?
Confusion.
Confusion that comes through ears and eyes. The child must begin to make sense out of all of that stuff coming into his head, and he must believe that all of that is inside him, and he's right. We project it back out and we're wrong. It all takes place right in here. Yes?
Could the fetus have had any illusions of visual experience through dreaming?
The thing is that you cannot dream of a visual, you cannot have a visual experience dreaming until you have actually seen something. Now, the reason we know that is having reports of the dreams of blind people who've been congenitally blind. Their experiences are not in terms of what they see. Their dreams are in terms of what they feel and hear and bump into. It's done in, although I know a blind girl and who writes poetry, and it's very vivid poetry. It's rich in colors and everything. And she's come to realize what colors trees are and what colors the sky is and so on. And so her poetry sounds like she's sighted. And I once had a kind of, once I got to know her well, I was very curious about it. And so I asked her about it. And she says, well, I have my own imagination about what the color is. And I said, well, what do you think the difference between yellow and red is? And she said, well, red's warmer. But you see, there was no way she could explain the difference in terms of sight because that's an experience she never had. So she translated the meaning of all of these colors into other terms. Temperature. She even had seen these colors in terms of sadness and happiness. She saw colors in terms of sharpness and softness. She saw colors in terms of cruelty and kindness. So she had a richer notion of color than we do. It's just that it's all wrong. I mean, it just has no objective verification in terms of light wave frequency, you see. And she never had a dream that had any vision in it, you see. But it's hard for us to imagine having a dream in which you don't see anything because most of our dreams seem largely visually oriented. And to some extent, the rest of the senses are implicated too, but mostly vision for most of us anyway. Well, you can have brightness. You can have how much darkness or how much white or black. You know, would that be saturation? You can have various combinations of all of those things. So those are the basic differentiations that you need perceptually. Then, of course, there are many, many other things. Let me just put on for you a minute what they look like. Yeah, why don't you just turn that off for a minute, because this won't make any sense, it'll just waste the tape. We have many other potentialities knocked out of commission. But if you lose your hearing, or you lose your sight, that is a major deprivation. And therefore taste and, to some extent, touch and smell are not so critical to survival. Although smell in earlier evolutionary times was a very important part. In fact, the major part of the brain dealing with smell is called the rhine-encephalon. Rhine is a Greek word for nose. That's why a rhinoceros is called a rhinoceros, because the most conspicuous thing about him perhaps is his nose, or what's on his nose. And if you have an inflammation of the nose, it's called rhinitis. I don't know if they call that anymore, but... And the rhine-encephalon of animals, the rhine-encephalon of a bloodhound, for instance, is a very well-developed part of the dog's brain. And they can just discriminate from one smell from another to the finest degree. That's why they use a bloodhound to track down somebody, because if you can get any object that's belonged to that person and let the dog sniff it, he will even be able to pick up that smell just from the foot tracks of that person. That's why people who are being tracked by bloodhounds always try to find a river, because that confuses the dog, which you can see why, because part of that smell gets washed downstream, and the dog can't pick it up. We don't have such sharp noses, and I think it's a blessing myself, because some people do smell, and if we were bloodhounds, we'd be so uncomfortable all the time. We would even be able to say, well, I smell right guard and arid, unscented, and even though it's unscented, it would be scented, right? We'd be so distracted. So, and of course, some animals, I think dogs, for instance, don't see in color. There are two kinds of receptors in the retina, rods and cones. The rods tell you only that it's light or dark. The cones tell you what frequency the light is. And you have to have it to be fairly bright before you'll even see a frequency. That's why, have you noticed when it gets dark at night, the colors go? Well, you know that your red car is still red at night, but from a distance it doesn't look red, it just looks dark. And that's because you've got to have a certain amount of light before the cones will be activated, and the cones will tell you what color something is. And in arranging environments, we know how much light you need for the eye to do a decent visual discrimination exercise. And that's why it's desperate if there's a budget cut and they decide to save on electricity, and therefore they put in 40-watt bulbs, because the cones then won't be activated in the same way because there's not insufficient light. Well, we're going to do the same thing with, as I said, with hearing, audition, and in fact, Sue Thoreau is now putting together a kind of a basic paper on this, because how to pay attention by listening is a very critical ability in school, and therefore children need to know how to do it. So we're going to center in on that. The cognitive area has to do with ways of differentiating and integrating.
Can I raise a question?
Yes.
How are you dealing with the intersensory problem, rather than dealing with a single mode, auditory or visual?
Yes.
Are you focusing on that as a separate problem in and of itself?
Yeah, I talked about that just before you came in.
Sorry.
That's okay. That falls in the category of another kind of integration, cross-modal integration. So there are integrations and differentiations within every area, but we talked about the cross-modal thing. And this is important because you can even see the importance of it in the way the brain is structured, because there are enormous fibers going from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. And for instance, from the temporal lobe, which is where hearing is, to the occipital lobe where seeing is. Because when I do something like this, I am integrating a sound with what I see and with what I am feeling. So what has to happen there is that the motor cortex that's recording what I'm feeling in my muscles has to be organized with what is seeing back there. So there's just you wouldn't believe the battery of cables that go from here up to here, and then it goes from here into the ears, and that has to go to there, and it goes to there. So that right away there are actual nerve impulses that connect those three events. Now there are a lot of studies done in which you cut that. And when that kind of thing happens, you have disintegration, literally, in the sensory field. And there are, for instance, different kind of agnosias and aphasias come about because there are certain integrations that are lacked. For instance, a person might be able to tell you the letters in a word, but they can't recognize the word. And that's because the area of speech where the word recognition and meaning is not connected anymore with the occipital lobe. So there's just a variety of those disintegrations which are impossible. And of course, building up the structure of these integrations cross-modally is very important. Now, you've all seen this. I'm going to move forward with it so we can get it on the videotape. This is the breakdown. He's kidding me. Of course, you can't see it, can you? You have to read it backwards through this. This is the list of one list of the processes that make up thinking. Got it?
Yeah.
All right. Now, this is an old list. We don't even believe it anymore. Yes, no, don't erase it. I mean, one's as good as another, I guess. Well, the reason I say we don't believe it anymore is that we found some of these words, when you get right down to it, mean the same thing. And therefore, on some cases, though, they mean almost the same thing, but not quite, and therefore it's worth keeping a separate word because of that tiny difference. Now, what does this boil down to? It boils down to different ways of differentiating and integrating and generalizing information. They constitute the chief patterns by which thought is carried forward. Now, there must be 20 million others, too, but we only try to hit the main ones. The idea being that if you could get the main ones down, all the others would be filled in. I think it's pretty clear, at least I'm convinced, that after these millions and millions of years of evolution, the human mind has been structured so that it cannot tolerate a violation of these thought processes once the basic structures are there. In other words, an illogical train of thought for somebody who has the basic logical structures in his head cannot be tolerated. Now, in working with children, I have a kind of an atmosphere in my house which cues my children to know that if they can build a logical case for what they want to do, chances are they'll be allowed to do it, all other things being equal. So they're great case builders. And every now and again I just say, I'm sorry, there will be no more case building today for doing things. It's time to go to bed. Because most of the case building centers around why they should stay up another hour. You know? And sometimes if they've got a good case, well, they get to, you see, so it's and they also know which kind of cases can be won with Nancy serving as the court, my wife, or which kind of cases are more apt to be adjudicated on in a favorable way in Daddy's court. See, so they know which way, they know which court is best for what cases, and they're always requesting a change of venue when if I say, well, go ask your mother about that, they say, no, we want you to decide. Because they know how this court operates, right? So, and the point is, what I'm trying to do in the way of all that is to show them and to make it worthwhile for them to exercise of a coherent line of thought by establishing a premise and moving from that premise. And they know very much that the biggest part of the job is to get me to accept the premise. Because once I've done that, I'm hooked. And, for instance, Melissa might come and say, do you think it's important for a teenager like me to have a sense of history? When I hear something like that, I say, oh. So I have to say, well, sometimes. But because if I say, well, yes, she'll say something like, well, there is a historical movie on TV tonight at 11. And you see, if they've got me agreed to that premise, then when she comes to the conclusion, And if I say, well, I'm sorry, you can't stay up, then I am accused of being an illogical thinker, and they know that is a way to hurt a daddy, especially this one, yes? Oh, kids are wonderful. You can learn an awful lot by trying to raise some. Well, we already have a number of specifications out on this. And you see this word up here, specification. That simply means a document which does several things. It explains what that process is. It summarizes the research pertinent to it. Gives a theoretical justification for it. In other words, it demonstrates why it supports learning competence. The document conveys some developmental information. In other words, where does seriation come? Does a child do it when he pops out of the womb, or do you have to wait a few years? Where does it come in the sequence? Thirdly, it expresses it in educational terms as an objective, and presents some prototypical experiences, some environments and some interactions, which if the child goes through, will internalize that process. And there is a statement on how you can evaluate it. In other words, what would you accept as observable evidence from which you could infer that the process has been internalized? And of course, you have a lot of work to do there yet. And these are what specifications look like. All the yellow ones are in volition, bottom there. All red ones are in perception. All blue ones like this are in cognitive. We don't have any affective specifications yet. As soon as Mag finishes her dissertation, she'll be cranking them out probably. And the psychomotor ones, didn't I bring any psychomotor ones? They're sort of cream colored. So we have them all color coded. Then there are higher order competencies, which we're going to get into this afternoon. And they're in different colors too. This isn't in moral competence. Well, we have broken this down and broken this down. All of the specifications in the volitional area are now done. This is the last one on will. And will is, you'll have this in the fall. This will be introduced in the fall. We introduced this in Hamden already. And now you will have everything from attention, which is the first specification in volition, to goal setting, which is the second one, and will. And these are all broken down into subcategories too. Will being broken down into self-arousal, perseverance, fantasizing, goal state, and effecting closure. And so the volitional area is now finished. And of course it'll be elaborated on and changed over years, but at least bit by bit, the whole thing is getting finished. Now, this afternoon I want to talk about the content curriculum and involve you in perhaps some experiences in beginning to flesh out your own understanding of the things, the information that I've talked about. It's now after 12:15, so is that
the idea of process as we're defining it has a tendency to fade rapidly and be irretrievable. And
some method in my madness here of repeating it. I'd like to put that word process in the context of hierarchical organization and building up, so that would be another connection. If we take the idea of classification as one patterned use of energy in the cognitive area. In other words, it is one of the main patterns by which thoughts are thought. The question then becomes, does that pattern get built up and become progressively more complex and organized in a hierarchical way? And the answer is yes. So we have built in this specification an idea, a definition of classification, where you start down here as soon as a child is able to do the first kinds of thinking that resemble classification. And we call that resemblance sorting. That's the first primitive sort of classification. A child, just perceptually, is able to see that he can put all of the dogs in one bunch, and or he can put all of the stuffed toys in one bunch and all the marbles in another. And he doesn't really have to think too much about what the qualities of those things are. But if you gave him a patch of a bunch of teddy bears and a bunch of marbles, and say, put these into two different groups, chances are very quickly he'd put the teddy bears in one group and the marbles in another. And this is the beginnings of classification. Ultimately, it means, of course, differentiating attributes and then integrating those attributes which define the class, and then to be able to match the defined or differentiated attributes with objects in the environment from which can be abstracted those same attributes, and then they can be placed in that class. As you move from resemblance sorting, which is the most primitive kind of classification, as you move from there to more advanced forms, things become more complex. And you finally get up to the highest orders of hierarchical classification, where you're dealing with such things as class inclusion. On page 12 of the specification, you have the whole paradigm here. It starts with resemblance sorting, consistent sorting, exhaustive sorting, conservation of classes, multiple class membership, matrices, sum-all relations, parts and parts relations, conservation of hierarchy, hierarchical classification, and class inclusion. Well, once a child can manage a way of thinking that includes all of those things, he will be in charge, consciously, of a way of dealing with information that comes to him that will make him effective as a thinker. Now, once you get all of them down, that we have on that big long list that I was showing you, you will have the basis for the most abstract logical thought, what you might call hypothetical deductive mathematical thinking. And there's no higher kind of thinking that we can think of at the moment.
What are some of the words on that sheet that we can't see or don't know?
Well, it says abstraction, analogy, analysis, associativity, asymmetry, causality. Now we have over here, or we have with us, a new specification on physical causality. This is a modality of thinking which is designed to see connections among things that are necessary by virtue of there having been a transfer of energy. It is a very important kind of thinking where technology and science are concerned. And we like kids to get in that right away. Because if you want to become a scientist and you have this thinking built into you right from the earliest stages, then it's easy to go right into science. Classification, combination, conjunction, correlation, deduction, disjunction, equivalence, extrapolation, hypothesis formation, identity, implication, inclusion, induction, inference, interpolation, interpretation, extrapolation, inversion, metaphor, negation, so on, object permanence. What we did to arrive at that list was to look through all of the literature on thinking and cognitive development and pull all together a list and begin searching them As I say, that list is out of date, but we don't have time to make up a new list at the moment. We will eventually make up a new list, and there will be a specification written on each one. Now, there are other kinds of thinking that are not included in this, which we have to experiment with. We've included the beginnings of them there because we have on here metaphor and analogy. Analogical thinking and metaphorical thinking are two more literary forms rather than mathematical scientific forms, and yet they have a great deal of importance. There is a great deal of explanatory power in an analogy, and you can help children understand things very much if you use analogies. But before the analogy is effective, the child must be able to analogize. And that means being able to differentiate things and integrate them in certain ways. The idea that I wanted to get across here is one process has a very simple beginning. It gets more and more complex through time, and everything has to get integrated. And if you present the experiences, you arrange particular environments and guide the child's interaction with it in particular ways, you will get changes in his head which will enable him to perform classification type thinking. And it should build up over time until you have a wonderful superstructure that enables him to process information, and he has names attached to all of this, which means he is consciously aware of what it is that he's doing when he's doing it, and that he can then assess any learning task and make a decision about what kinds of thought will be required to handle that problem, and therefore set to it.
Isn't the labeling of what one has learned that has been one of the minuses in education?
Absolutely. That's because the teachers themselves didn't know. Yes. No. You will be trained as a teacher without having any of these labels given to you. And you may require it of your children, but you won't even know what it is you've required of them, because you yourself have not gotten a label for it. You may even know the labels, but chances are you will not have deliberately associated the label with what you're doing with the child, which means it cannot have appeared as a conscious, deliberate objective in the curriculum. See, that's one of the advantages of labeling it. Ernest Cassirer, the great philosopher, wrote 3 volumes called An Essay on Man, in which he builds the case for man's capacity to symbolize being the foundation of consciousness. Now, we have to be interested in consciousness because our definition of learning competence is the conscious ability to do those things. Now, if those things are going to become conscious, then if our theories are right, those things have to be symbolized so that the kid himself can store them. At least the process will be greatly facilitated if he can do it. So you put your finger on it. And one of the things we have yet to research, Ruth, is at what time can you label the process in a way that it makes sense to the child? Because if you tell a kid who can do resemblance sorting, you say, honey, did you know you're doing resemblance sorting? Well, chances are you'll get a frown back because that word is perhaps too big to negotiate at the moment. But at some point in the course of time, he needs to know what it is he's doing. And he probably can understand the word sort. Resemblance may be too big a word. And you will probably explain the task to him using more simplified terminology. But it will be related to this. You want things that resemble each other to go together in one pile. See, and eventually he gets the idea of resemble, and then resemblance and sorting. And pretty soon resemblance sorting would not be a hard thing for him to understand. As a matter of fact, we underestimate the terminology that children can assimilate. And they can handle fairly large words. All they have to do is hear them often enough. And of course, they will be able to understand the words largely before they produce them. That has been very well established. And what you do is you introduce the words as you're doing what you're doing. And ultimately, the child comes very quickly to associate those words with what you're doing, and therefore that's the way they build up a vocabulary and a semantic structure of meaning associated with these symbols, the words. McVicker Hunt was talking about this very issue as a part of his language extension operation in the way of building vocabularies. And in his little groups in the Tehran orphanage, the aides, when they were washing the child's ears, they'd say, "We are washing your ear." And when they came to the word ear, they stuck the rag in. See? I mean, gently, not as harshly as I made it sound there. You see, it sounded like it would come out this side. So that the child came to understand that that was ear, because there was an active experience of associating a sensation with the word ear. And that's the way, of course, vocabulary is built up, and a meaningful one. That's why if you just sit tight in the crib and you can't move around, you don't hear anybody say anything, you don't get these symbols attached, and you are really less conscious as a creature. So that notion of consciousness is important to us because it is the means by which the competence of the kids as learners is facilitated, and that in part means labeling the process itself.
I keep thinking as a mother of all the things that we do with our children, all the little rhymes and songs and so forth, you know, about their toes and their fingers and things like that we do just automatically or have done over the past several generations.
Yes, those are all very good. But you know, we found out that certain mothers, lower class mothers, since they know that the children can't talk, feel foolish talking with a baby. Say a 4-month-old baby. So they would feel silly taking a 4-month-old baby and saying, "This little piggy went to market, this little piggy stayed home, this little piggy ate pork and beans, and this little piggy," I don't know what I forgot what it is now, but my mother did it. What is it?
One of the skills of
Yes, I got that part, but I had to substitute pork and beans. Roast beef. Yes, I knew it was something. I think if we...
It's all right, everybody's substituting that now.
And this little piggy had cottage cheese and this. Well, it would be embarrassing to tell that little piggy that he's eating pork and beans. That would be a form of cannibalism. Yes, very embarrassing. But I did that to my kids from day one. I used to tell my little girls, "I just love you so much I eat you, and the only reason I haven't eaten you is that I don't know whether to begin with your nose or your toes." I mean, I told them that from the day they were born, and I used to nibble their toes and nibble their nose. And so then I went on too long, and finally one day I said, "I know it's the toes or the nose." You know, then you know you played the game too long, right? I said, yes, right. I should have complexified the task. I should have talked about mastication of her cortex or something like that, or maybe you can think of some multi-syllabic terminology here. Well, we can take any one of these processes and see where they begin, see what their fundamental underpinnings are, and then see how they go out like that. Then you have to take case body work, well, where I had a child for only 30 minutes. And you see what you can do in just 30 minutes or 4 days. Well, lots can be done. I think I may have told you the experience of the Head Start school in Elmira, but I don't know if it may be worth just repeating it briefly for those who didn't hear it. But Don Streets and I went to Elmira. Don, who is the associate project director for Anisa, had been working as a consultant for Head Start and follow through, and he was assigned to visit a number of Bank Street models. You know, in follow through and plan variation and follow through, they tried to have 22 different models be adopted by various sites, and then they were going to compare these models and decide which ones were best, and then the next year around everybody could be asked to take the best models. Well, you know, they do everything halfway, and so nothing ever works out as any different from anything else. But so we went to visit a Bank Street based model, and we watched what the teachers did. And so we said, we will watch what this teacher does with this child for a half an hour or even an hour, and then we will do something in Anisa for 5 minutes and show how in that 5 minutes we can get 100 times more educational mileage out of the experience than the Bank Street teacher did for an hour or half an hour. I can't remember what it was. I think it was just a half an hour maybe. Could have very easily be extended to an hour though, because nothing much happened in a half an hour, so if you just double it, you just 2 times still 0. Of course, something a little more than that was no doubt going on, but in this particular case, the children were playing around a water table, and the teacher made 2 interventions. The environment had already been arranged. It was a water table and had some little teapots and saucers in there. And the kids were 2.5 to 4. Maybe most of them were near 4, but the child that we decided to work with wasn't quite 3 yet. The teacher made 2 interventions, both of which were directed to admonishing the child about getting the floor wet. And they had been kind of poking one another, and there was a little kind admonition about not so much poking, please. And the teacher did it very nicely. I mean, in the best Bank Street tradition, it was done nicely. The question was, however, what could the teacher have done in that half hour that would have brought those children right along and put them on the cutting edge of their development so that they would be excited and enthusiastic learners? So, half hour went by, and we said, okay, now we're going to demonstrate some Anisa principles. In 5 minutes, we'll do 100 times more than was done in half an hour. So one little girl was pouring water out of a teapot into a bottle cap until it sank. I know Eileen has heard this story, and Mag has a dozen times, but it's a clear case of exemplifying the differences. Now, and she kept doing that. Now, when you see a child repeating something, you can say to yourself, that child is getting something out of that. Now, of course, if this child is repeating something for the 37th year, you know, there's pathology there, mental retardation. But, you know, for 20 minutes or half an hour, or even 2 or 3 days, if a child keeps repeating something, it is because they are right there on the cutting edge and they are learning and consolidating something, and you can be sure that if you can discover what that is and slightly help it, you'll make tremendous gains. This is the advantage, of course, in allowing children to have options. Otherwise, you won't see it, you see. So, I got down on my knees because we have this idea that it's better to look straight into the child's eye. Otherwise, they just see they're always interacting with the undersides of people's chins. You need to get down, you see, where you can see them. Because there is much more meaning conveyed if a child can see your eyes. That's why even the kind of glasses one wears is important. They must be able to have direct eye contact. If you've got heavily tinted glasses or one-way glasses, it's bad news. I've never seen any teacher wear shades in that sense, but if they do, it's bad news. I said to this child who wasn't quite 3, who was pouring water in this bottle cap until it sank, and then she'd reach down to the bottom of the little water table and pull it up and start again. I want to assess developmental level on a cognitive dimension and pick an objective, a process objective from the cognitive domain, and move on from there. So I probed by asking questions, and we're going to have a session tomorrow on dealing with kinds of questions as a form of guiding interaction, which is a pedagogical technique. I said, "Honey, why does the bottle cap sink?" She said, "Because it knows how to." Now, it's well known that children use animistic explanations rather than cause and effect explanations to account for why certain things happen the way they do. And she was no exception. She just said this bottle cap knew how to sink, and that's why it sank. So I said to myself, okay, I'm going to take this child in the space of 5 minutes from that primitive animistic notion of causality, which is no notion of causality at all, and bring her as far as she can go at her developmental level in understanding cause and effect thinking in the framework of Archimedes' law, which is that a sinking body floats until it displaces its weight in water. And then it stops sinking, and if it hasn't gone clear down, of course, part of it's still above the surface, in which case it floats. Now, in order to do this, I must get the child to witness some differentiations between the behavior of the bottle cap under different circumstances. I must get her to see what the bottle cap does when it's full, and what it does when it's empty, and what it does when it's half full, to make those differentiations and see the connections. Now, right away, you see a problem, namely, there's only one bottle cap, and a child who isn't 3 yet will be percept bound, if you know something about developmental levels. To be percept bound means that you cannot compare 2 events if they occur at different times. They must occur simultaneously and be in the visual field simultaneously before the comparison can be made easily. In other words, I can't use the same bottle cap because our law of the excluded middle and contradiction says that the bottle cap cannot be both full and empty at the same time. And that means if the child is going to compare empty and full bottle caps, I got to have more than one. So we had to fish around. That's arranging the environments. After all, you have to find out if there are deficiencies in the environment, and then you have to remedy those, and then you have to arrange what you get after you finally fulfilled the obligation of getting what you need, accounting for the deficiency. So I got 2 or 3 other bottle caps. We rummaged around and found them. Now I'm introducing a lot of things at the same time with the child, but my focus is on causality within the context of the physical law of Archimedes, where we're going to talk about measurement, the beginnings of math, and there's going to be psychomotor things in here because I'm going to ask the child to pour the water in here, and that means controlling the teapot and being able to anticipate. See, because when I ask the child to put just a little tiny bit in here, make it half full, I'm introducing the word half. I don't even know if the child knows half, but I'm going to explain to her what half is and make sure she knows half by the end of the 5 minutes. I tell her to pour the water in the bottle cap and make it half full. And then I say, put it just up to about here, a little bit in, not clear full. By explaining, the child comes to understand what clear full and half full is. So she takes the pot, she goes like this, and she fills it clear full, spills over. And that's because she stops pouring when she sees the bottle cap is half full. But there's all that water still leaving the spout that has to come down in it, you see, because she's not able to account for the amount of water that leaves the spout. You have to stop pouring before it looks half full to get it half full. Well, she kept pouring it all the way full, and I kept dumping part of it out and saying, now it's half full. And finally, she got the idea that she had to. She just didn't even look. She just watched the pot. It just went like that. About the third time, I put the bottle cap in the water and asked her now to record her observation to me in terms of the behavior of the bottle cap. So, what did the bottle cap do? I said, did it sink? She said, no, it didn't sink. Take the second bottle cap. I say, fill it almost full, but not clear full, but fuller than the last one. Now we're introducing comparative differentiations. Full, fuller, fullest, clear full. So we fill it a little bit more. We put it in the water. I said, did it sink? She said, well, almost, but didn't. It did sink a little bit more, obviously because it's getting heavier, which is the point. Take the last bottle cap. I said, fill it clear full. Put it down. Sank. I said, what did this one do? I said, now why does the bottle cap sink? She said, it sinks because it's full of water. See, now that's one step along from it sinks because it knows how to. So I took two of the bottle caps and I filled one with water and left one empty. Told her to hold out her hands, close her eyes. And I put a full one and an empty one on her hands and said, can you tell the difference between them? And I'm introducing the notion of heavy now. Is one of them heavier than the other? She said, yes, this one is. She could tell which one had the water in it. I said, open your eyes. I took the two off, put them in the water. One that was full sank to the bottom. And I said, now what makes the bottle cap sink? She said, it sinks because it's heavy. Now, that only took 5 minutes. The interesting thing was, the minute that little exercise started, the other 4 children who were sloshing water and fussing came around and had their nose right down in there. Everybody was alert and keyed in and tuned in because they somehow sensed something is cooking here. And they all want to do it. Now, from an Anisa point of view, that one experience is not enough to consolidate the train of thought. It has to be repeated several times. And one good way of repeating that is now have this child explain it to the other children. Well, the minute we started that, she was ready to run with it. And the little boy said he wanted to pour, and she said, nothing doing. She's the executive in charge of this operation. You can tell you. She's going to do the pouring. He's not educated to do it. He's unqualified to do this Archimedes experiment. I mean, you could just get the whole thing. You could just see this child running a business in 20 years, you know, because once she had that little bit of knowledge about it, I tell you, she would have moved to the situation. Well, we would ask her to maybe demonstrate it again, and then we would have to encourage her, well, you got to let Johnny try it now. See, she became very possessive with this knowledge now. She was willing to share it, but she was going to control all the materials nonetheless. See, what reminds me of a lot of teachers I know. They don't want the kids to do it. They want to demonstrate it themselves and let it go farther than that. But the point was that all that took place in about 5 minutes. And because we were on the cutting edge, there was tremendous interest. And all these kids were about the same age, and they were about at the same developmental levels, and therefore they all could participate in some way, shape, or form. Well, that is simply an indication of how having something in mind as an objective functions as a purpose, which then structures what you do and becomes the final cause of it. Now, the reason the Bank Street teacher didn't do anything around the water table is that her objective was to have the children play with water. And as far as she was concerned, the objective had been achieved. Because, in fact, her children were playing with water. Well, we feel that kind of an objective doesn't get you anywhere very fast. The objectives must be more specific, and they must be related to something that's overall important in terms of the growth and development of the child. Of course, for us, it's related to the actualization of potentiality at an optimum rate. Because the minute that child begins to develop this causal modality of thinking, this represents the actualization of a cognitive potentiality. It is reflected in a patterned use of energy through thinking, which we call causal thinking. A form of logical thinking, you see.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
You had an ideal setup where you were working with one child. How much of what you did would be destroyed if you used it with a teacher doing a demonstration with the other children looking on? How much did the 4 children looking on get from this that you were doing with the one child? I guess it's fun.
Well, they got an awful lot, in my opinion. But it would have to be repeated. For instance, the next day that they were around the water table, I would, in just a few minutes, organize the same thing and maybe get a different child to do it and let it be repeated until they can do it on their own. And then at some point, when they begin to understand the volume and density and weight, then of course you can get the full impact of Archimedes' principle. Our point is simply this, that every one of those physical laws, like Boyle's law or Archimedes' principle or whatever, we get them all lined up. We find out what the beginning, earliest understandings of them can be and introduce those in the context of the particular processes involved, whatever they might be. In other words, why do you wait until high school to introduce Archimedes' principle if you can introduce it at age 2.5? After all, the bigger the foundation and the quicker you get it, the more you can build on it. And the happier the kids are. Yes?
What would have been the difference if, say, the next day with another group of children in the same situation, you walked in with your bag full of bottle caps all ready to impose this way of learning? Was it crucial that the child was first of her own choice filling caps with water?
Could be. That's why we say that the arrangement of the environment generally should invite spontaneous activity on the part of the child within the framework of specific ground rules. Because, as you will see when we talk about the theory of teaching tomorrow, one of the strategies has to do with deciding whether or not to intervene. Sometimes you wouldn't want to necessarily. Yes?
We had a child one time last year told his mother, he's 3.5 years old, told his mother that there are waves in the air.
Waves in the air?
Yes, that you can't see. Now, he told his mother this, and she had in turn told us, what would you do in a situation like that where this, it couldn't be shown on a film to a child? Yes, you can. He understands.
This child is right, of course.
Yes. What would you do in a situation like that? It's totally unreal.
No, it's absolutely real. You should sit down at once and have this child explain it. No, there are lots of ways you can do it. For instance, if you had a film of a field of grain waving, you can see in the waving grain evidences of waves in the wind. There are ways of doing it. You could drop a pebble into some water and see the concentric waves going out and say that certain things are going like this in the air. Well, I did this to Sarah. See, if you go like this, the child can feel the waves but not see them. And if they can feel them, that's evidence that they're there, even if they can't see them. And of course, there are various kinds of waves going through there. Those the light waves, of course, are waves. The air is just filled with them. There are sound waves.
I think that's what his mother said he was talking about.
Yes.
And he said also something about the orbit of the sun. He's unbelievable.
This child is going to be Einstein.
I don't know what we're going to do with him next year.
Well, you better put him in the 5th grade. No, but you see, now a child like that that's got an inquiring mind ought to be given some experiences to keep that alive.
That's what we're gonna have to be
Yeah,
careful
that's right.
this year,
Yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
I
Yes.
have a question. I'm not familiar enough with Bank Street to know whether your criticisms are justified, but I wonder how much is the fault of the Bank Street or any other model? And how much is the fault of this individual teacher who may not have been implementing what Bank Street was? Now, what I'm saying is, and you have the same problem, you have this beautiful model, and I'm sure Bank Street thinks theirs is gorgeous, and then you have these varying degrees of competence putting
Yes.
this model into practice.
Sure.
And then people come around and observe, and they say, gee, you know, this Bank Street teacher or this Anisa teacher didn't really take advantage of this situation.
Sure.
And then an expert can come along and in 5 minutes do it beautifully.
Sure.
And
Which is really unfair. And I didn't mean this necessarily a criticism of Bank Street. It's
But,
just that there is a basic Bank Street principle, namely that, which we subscribe to in part, which is that if you provide a rich environment and put children in it, they will all select things at their developmental levels at all times. Well, I don't think you can say sometimes they will, but you can't say all times. That's the presumption. We know that they don't, as a matter of fact. They may stay too long just repeating the same thing, and they need to be gently nudged into new territory, and or otherwise encouraged or seduced or induced or whatever to try something new. And of course, you can't push this too fast because that may introduce discontinuities. But that there needs to be some loving encouragement and so on, I think there's no doubt. And a lot of this can be done simply by introducing novelty that is defined by the disparity between the child's background and the present experience. That's what we mean by the optimal match between the profile of the child's, the profile of his imminence, you might call it, and the experience you're thinking of now. You want it to be slightly ahead of where he is. If it's right on where he is, it'll be familiar, and therefore he might be bored. If it's too far away, he won't even recognize it and won't connect with it. It needs to be right there, and every time we've been able to do that, and we've predicted that he would just sail into it, they always do. Now, it would be possible, of course, for Mag or myself to come into an Anisa classroom in Suffield and say, look at all these kids just kind of going around. Why isn't there an intervention every 5 minutes? Well, there can't be because the teacher's busy over here. She can't be over here. But our point, in this particular case, the Bank Street teacher wasn't intervening with anybody else. She was walking around, kind of shedding a pleasant atmosphere, but she didn't do anything, except her interventions the whole morning were to settle little disputes and sort of have a presence of an authority figure there that wouldn't allow anything to get out of hand to them. And I think the children were, by and large, very happy there. It's just that by a little bit of intervention, which didn't take any time at all, you could get so much more mileage out of the experience, you see.
So you're talking about the quality of the intervention.
Yes, and the timing and the the whole thing. I think that if a teacher is sitting on her hands just watching, she ought to have a reason for doing that. It could be that she's tired, and that may be a reasonable reason. But ordinarily, she ought to be up, seeing what's going on, to see if she can arrange an environment and guide the interaction of the children with that environment to achieve one of the objectives in the curriculum.
Dan, I have a question about it. Follows what Gail said. Now, is the Bank Street model a training teacher's model as Anisa is a teacher training model?
It's supposed to be.
It is.
But
I wasn't clear.
the problem with it, again, is that it has the model has no specifications. So that when Dawn went to Bank Street in Elmira and Bank Street in Atlanta and Bank Street in someplace else, it varied enormously depending on the teachers who were there. And they tried, I mean, the Bank Street people went from Bank Street, just like we're coming from UMass, to try to do in-service training, you see. But no matter what you do, we'll always face what you were talking about, Gail. Namely, there will be teachers of varying degrees of understanding of the model working with it. Some will do it better than others. And some will do it good in one area, do it well in one area, but not well in another. And some will do it well in, say, 95% of the areas, but not in 5%. So, I mean, that you just have to live with. But when you talk about something, you talk about it in ideal terms, so everybody knows what to struggle after. But we'll all fall short of it. But if you don't make the struggle, and you won't make the struggle if the ideal isn't set before you. And the point is, if our thesis is correct, you can always be a better teacher next year than you were last year by learning something new and gaining a new experience based on that something new that you learned. So that in 10 years, you should, if you are deliberately intending so, to become a fabulous teacher. At least you can become more fabulous than you used to be.
Dan, are you eventually going to have this incorporated in colleges? You know, is this a far-ranging effect,
Yes.
like 4 years of Anisa?
That's right.
You know,
That's
great,
right.
Because I think it's well needed.
Yes, no,
To
that's
understand
our intention. And not only that, but we would have, when we get our big center established, we plan to establish a unit called a Triple T unit, the training of the teacher trainers. So that, say, a school like Central Connecticut College investigated the model over a 2-year period, and they decide they want to build now their whole training program around that, or they want to have one whole unit. They want to offer this as an option for people who enroll there. They would then work with us for 3 years or more while we train the professors.
It's a large scale.
Yes. Well, it'll take a long time. You know, this thing, you get an idea that you just don't tidy this up in a nice little package and send it off in a do-it-yourself kit.
Very long.
I'm so glad you said that.
I mean, that kit, when you open it up, has Mag in it, and has me in it, and has a lot of people in it.
But Dan, how about you speak a moment to the advantage of the team? I mean, everybody working together. There's the cohesiveness of everybody working around a body of theory. And even though it may be interpreted here and there a little differently, at least the main body of structure is there.
Yes, you see, if your training has been anywhere good, if you visited an Anisa school in Atlanta and one in Elmira, you can say to the teachers in both places, when they're doing something with a child, what are you doing? And the teacher should be able to say what she is doing. Now, she depends on how far along she is in the training. She might, you know, if she mumbles, well, I don't know, I'm confused, and the whole thing's up for grabs. Well, it's a sign that she's in the first day of training, or she's not very good. And if she's in her 9th year of training, you can be sure she'll be counseled out of the profession during the following year. But the advantage of having people operating on a distinct body of theory is that everybody understands what everybody else is trying to do, even if they're doing it quite differently. And after all, I think you can appreciate that you can have 5 people having internalized the Anisa theory. They will have their own quite definite personal teaching styles because they're different people. It would be a violation of our own philosophical presuppositions if we thought we could get 5 people and make them teach exactly alike. What they can do, though, is have similar objectives, all related to learning competence. And they can understand, in varying degrees, how to apply the theory. Their application of it will reflect their own past and their own history, and therefore will include a wide variation of possibilities. So you never find anything so specific in Anisa like asking a child what something is, and then when he says it, giving him an M&M, which will look pretty much exactly alike no matter where you see it done. However, that doesn't mean that on some occasion we might not even do that. because that represents a very definitive form of feedback, which may be important to help a child get over a certain problem at a certain time, but as the basis for a total system, it doesn't seem to work very well. Well, I want to take some time now to talk about the organization of the content curriculum. And that'll kind of wind us up for today. Then tomorrow, I think we'll break down into the small groups to do the things which are more along in the pedagogical part anyway, rather than in curriculum. One of the things that makes man different from all other creatures is his capacity to transmit culture. Culture means ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. And therefore, culture represents all of those things that are learnable. Is it Picasso painting culture? No, the painting isn't. But that painting is a good thing to have around. And how to do the painting is learnable, and therefore that's culture. The painting is a work of art. How to produce it is culture. In other words, culture is anything that's learnable, and generally speaking, anthropologists say that it's not really a part of the culture unless a significant percentage of people learn it. In other words, we eat with knives and forks, and that's a way of eating. And therefore, it is a part of our culture to eat in this way, because almost everybody does. Now, the one person who eats with his feet, although that's learnable, you can learn how to do it, although it's a bit of a strain on the back, is really not a part of our culture, and therefore we don't cite that as part of the culture. Now, because culture is transmittable through learning from one generation to the next, it is cumulative. And that's what makes us different from all other creatures. You see, when Mama Dachshund dies, she takes to the grave with her everything she learned. She didn't store it symbolically and transmit any of it to her puppies. There's not wonderful stories of the family tree. There are not wonderful stories of what Granddad did, or what Grandma used to do, or this wonderful pie that, your Aunt Susie used to make. No, there's none of that. They just bark and romp around, and they die, and that's it. And therefore, every generation of dachshunds looks exactly the same as every other generation of dachshunds. They don't build anything up so that there is change. The reason we experience rapid social and technological change is precisely that condition of learnability and transmissibility of a culture. So that the generation that we are transmitting things to is different from our generation by virtue of having had so many new things transmitted to it earlier. And they will then build on that, and they will learn new things which they will transmit to the next generation. And the curve of acceleration is just mind-boggling. Such that information itself has proliferated at such a pace that teachers can no longer see their major role as dispensers of information. Because there's too much of it, you never do it. You should see yourselves as facilitators of process and making children competent learners, and at the same time dispensing basic information, because after all, you have to process something. You can't have the kid coming up and say, Mom, I'm the greatest thinker in the world, but I don't know any information about anything. No, you have to know something. And the point is, though, what information is really the most important information to know? And how should it be organized? Anisa speaks to both of those issues. The classification of the content curriculum, or the organization of the content curriculum, is organized around the classification of environments. We have organized the classification of environments around Whitehead's specification of the layers of being in the universe, what he calls ontological layers. He says if you look at the universe, you can see that it comes in layers, and that these layers are defined by boundary conditions. The first layer is mineral, and that layer is characterized by the cohesion of the atoms into molecules and the cohesion of molecules into compounds. When you add to that the possibility of growth through photosynthesis and reproduction, you have the vegetable layer or botanical layer. It's more complex, it's more advanced, and there is a reasonably distinct boundary condition between the two. When you add to the characteristics here the possibility of mobility, the senses, and learning, you have the animal level. And when you add to that consciousness, the capability of symbolic manipulation, which gives you the possibility of an extraordinary memory, which is immanence, and the capacity to respond to abstract ideals and notions as purpose, as final cause, man. And Whitehead goes on to say that there are things beyond that that we don't know about. And he's willing to call all of that God, or just unknowables, or ultimate unknowns.
Aesthetic?
What?
Aesthetic?
Well, it deals with aesthetics ultimately, as you'll see, but it's... He says that, curiously enough, that if you try to understand the mineral thing, you can't completely unless you speculate about the next level up. You can't understand this if you don't speculate about that, you can't understand this if you don't speculate about this, and you can't understand man unless you will speculate about that. And these speculations is what theology is, or philosophy, or religion. They're all parts of that. So, we would organize the information about the world in which we live along these lines. But we make a big division here and a big one there, and kind of lump all these together so that you have 1, 2, 3 basic classifications of environment. Now, the interesting thing is that most educational institutions in the world have, in fact, organized the informational part of the curriculum along these lines. So that you have physics, chemistry, and astronomy down here. And you have botany here. Here you have zoology, biology. And here you have all of the human sciences, psychology, physiology, anatomy, human physiology, psychology, sociology, anthropology. They're pretty well organized in this way. That's a little simplistic, but it does give you an idea. There's history, linguistics, all kinds of things in here about man. But things are pretty much organized that way. That's why when we come to a school system, the organization of the informational part of the curriculum is pretty well already done, and it's there. Now, you wouldn't necessarily try to keep these parts of the curriculum separate all the time because they are connected. These layers are connected, as you well might imagine. This is only to make sure that you have a basic organization of it so that you don't leave things out. But they're going to be interrelated, obviously. And then if you want to concentrate in one of the areas, that's possible. You can do it. Now, working with these unknowns turns out to be one of the trickiest of the entire operations because it is a different kind of environment than the other two. And you see, it's hierarchical, which means that there are unknown things down here, and there are unknown things here, and unknown things here, and unknown things here, and then there are ultimate unknowns here. For instance, imagine for a moment where the end of the universe is. Well, once you imagine the end, you wonder what's beyond it. On the other hand, it is hard for you to imagine that it doesn't have an end. So what do? Well, you might accept the thesis that the universe is expanding in all directions at the speed of light. But then your question will be, well, what in the world did it expand into? There must have been some space there, empty space. Does empty space go on forever? Does it never have an end? Well, yes, you think it should have an end. But you can't imagine having an end either. Will you ever know? It's done. Some people think when you die you find out. Well, I don't know myself. I doubt it. I'm not going to experiment right away. I know I'm going to have that opportunity at some time. I'm going to be patient. I'm a patient person by nature. I'll wait. But we got onto this idea of the unknowns and facing unknowns because to know that something is unknown is a byproduct of consciousness. We know when we know, and that makes it possible for us to know when we don't know. You can even know that you knew something and have now forgotten it because you've stored information that you knew it. And you can remember that you knew it, even though you can't remember what it was you knew. It's very complicated, as you will see when we get into the memory seminar on Monday. The thing gets more complicated because the processes of the process curriculum also have information about them. Which is a part of the content curriculum. And the content curriculum is largely a cognitive operation centering around the capacity of man to symbolize, and therefore is an enormously important part of the whole operation. Well, let me put it all together very briefly now, and we'll have a chance to go into it. Here's the child filled with, we'll put S for self, filled with or endowed with an infinitude of potentiality. And that child will interact with the physical environment, which includes those first three layers: mineral, vegetable, and animal of Whitehead. Our theory says that potentiality is translated into actuality as it interacts with the environment. And we would expect if the environments are different and the interactions are different, the potentialities that actualized will bear the traces of those differences. So as the self interacts with the physical environment, potentialities from 5 categories: perceptual, cognitive, affective, volitional, psychomotor, are actualized. But as they are actualized, these potentialities, they become powers, or manifestations of energy use. But these manifestations of energy use do not reflect randomness. There is a pattern there. There is a structure there. And we call the integrated pattern utilization of energy from all these categories of potentialities, as they are structured when interacting with the physical environment, results in material values. Now, I don't want to get into a great detailed discussion of values today because we're going to take it up on Monday. But this is how we have solved all of the 25 million dilemmas in value theory. It comes down ultimately to what you do with the only thing that you have charge over, and that's your energy. And it connects with the layman's definition of a value, because if you say you value something but you don't put any energy into it, then it's a sign you don't really value it. And we know that people may say what they value, but if they don't act on it, it's not very convincing. And that's, we intuit that if people don't invest their energies in what they say they believe in, then we don't think they really believe in it all that much. So we say, well, they don't really value it. On those values, on that patterned use of energy that we say represents material values, represents a higher order competency called technological competence. These material values, this structuring, is influenced also by the information about these environments which you have assimilated. Now, here's the key factor. If that information about the material world, the physical environments that you have assimilated contains error, it will cause you to pattern the use of energy in regard to that environment in a different way, such that you will be slightly out of touch with the reality of that environment, and therefore you will not be as effective in dealing with it as you would if you had acted on the basis of information which represented truth. So the more error you have in the information about the environments, the more the way you use the energy when you interact with that environment will be slightly out of touch with it. And of course, we interact with environments largely on the basis of their appearance. And that sometimes will get us into trouble. Because if our sense perception doesn't tell us certain things, then we don't get the information. For instance, carbon monoxide has no odor. The reality of carbon dioxide is that it is poisonous and will kill you. And therefore, your information must come from cognitive, conceptual knowledge of that phenomenon, because you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it or smell it. But if you breathe it, you die. Now, of course, if you're stuck in a garage and the car is running, you can smell something, but that's other things, not the carbon monoxide. When you interact with the human environment, that's this man up here now, that next level up. Energy, as you interact with it, is structured. And that patterned use of energy, as you interact with other human beings, represents social values. And on that rests moral competence. Keep in mind our definition of competence now. As you interact with the next layer, the unknowns, energy is structured in a certain way, which we are calling religious values. And that's because the only way you can interact with an unknown is on faith. Everybody does it, even if he's an atheist. It doesn't matter what religious denomination you belong to, or even if you don't belong to any. You have religious values defined in these psychological terms. But we got onto this idea of dealing with the unknowns, not only because of the things Whitehead said, but because the great anthropologist W. Lloyd Warner found in trying to analyze a society from an anthropological point of view that he could never understand and completely analyze the society, the culture, until he understood how they dealt with the things they didn't know, including ultimate unknowns. Now, if a Buddha or a Jesus Christ or a Muhammad or a Moses or a Zoroaster or a Lord Krishna appears and organizes your relationship to those ultimate unknowns, and large numbers of people buy that orientation, then you have an organized religion that grows up. But you still have religious values even if you don't belong to one of those groups. That's why most anthropologists say religion is a cultural universal, because all peoples face unknowns, and they all attempt to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. Now, you may have given people, given persons in a given society who say they don't believe anything, but the culture itself, there's not a case. But the culture itself, the society itself, did not have an organized set of assumptions or beliefs about those unknowns, which people call their religion. On that basis rests what you might call spiritual confidence. Or, if you don't like that, you could call it philosophical confidence. Now, there are three basic sets of symbol systems that help us record the information that puts us in touch with some appearance, or hopefully some reality behind the appearance, and helps us store information about the world out there. On this level, the symbol system is math. In this level, or in this category, it's language. French, Swahili, English. Here, it's the arts. These are the mediators of consciousness. They help us maintain the information that has influence on information, which has a bearing on how the energy gets used and its patterning. And therefore, these symbol systems are at the core of the Anisa curriculum. In something like this order: the arts, language, math. And we put them in that way because, don't forget, this is a hierarchical organization. Everything here subsumes everything here, and everything here subsumes this. But not the other way around necessarily, although there are interrelationships. Now, Whitehead makes the interesting point that these lower levels of creation are characterized by very little indeterminacy. By that he means that the subjectivist principle isn't terribly alive and well in these lower levels. It's there, but in a limited basis. In other words, a rock doesn't have all that much say over his own destiny. In fact, that's why Whitehead says, if you want to read a dull biography, ask a rock for his. See, biographies are dull unless people have choices. Now, but he says it, you know, that the rock does have some choice. It's just terribly limited. So you need a symbol system that is pretty specific and doesn't accommodate too much indeterminacy. And math doesn't. Math is best applied to things that are determinate. But as you'll see, there are a lot of unknowns down here, and therefore math has been used to conquer those unknowns. And to that extent, they are part of art. There's something beautiful about it. We're not going to have trouble to discuss the Anisa theory of beauty and truth. Beauty, truth, and goodness. We have to do that on Monday, or tomorrow maybe. Language gives a little more elbow room because man has a lot of indeterminacy. As to say, there's a lot of elbow room for him to make decisions about what he's going to be. Up here, it is indeterminate because it's unknown. And therefore, the arts, as a symbol system, is wide open. See, what a word represents is fairly specific. It's not as specific as what a number represents. But what an abstract work of art represents is even vaguer, unless it's just photographically representative. But even then, the creation of it, the organization of it, will carry other messages as well. Now, if we divide this into 3 basic sets, then you get an idea of total organization of the Anisa curriculum. Because here you will have math, science, technology. And you'll have all of the applied fields that come out of that. Here you will have language, human relations, ethics, law, history, sociology, anthropology, psychology, whatever else. Over here you have art, aesthetics, religion, philosophy. And the arts. Here you have language, and this breaks down, of course, into such other operations as reading and writing. Well, that gives you an idea of the extent of the Anisa curriculum. One final point, and that has to do with the 4th kind of environment, namely the self. The self is made up of the other 3 because it's made up of physical things, tissue that we're made up. It's human, and it's got a lot of unknowns in it. We don't know what the potentialities are ourselves. We don't know what our future holds. We don't know what's after death. We're not quite sure what tomorrow holds exactly. So the self emerges as a composite of all of these. In other words, when you pull together material values, social values, and religious values, they represent the total pattern use of energy of the organism. That defines the self. And on Monday, we're going to go into a detailed analysis of this, and I'm going to use the Anisa theories of the rehabilitation of juvenile delinquents and the Anisa theory of treating mental illness therapy as cases in point to illustrate the power of this theoretical perspective for understanding pathology and treatment of those pathologies. Any questions? No? No question. I promise that if you have a question, the answer will be in 2 sentences or less. My wife has a thesis that the reason people don't ask questions after I talk is because they're terrified of having another 15 minutes. That's why I'm making a promise that it'll be 2 sentences or less. Of course, they may be very complex sentences with lots of subordinate clauses and semicolons, but yes.
How would it affect the model if instead of man being a higher form, evolved in lower forms, it ends up man as a lower or degenerated, the species is default, de-evolutionized from a higher form.
Well, I think that would have tremendous implications for the model. It would mean our premise in first principle is wrong. And I'm not sure what we would do in that case, unless we would have to, our purpose would then have to be reverse the trend or further it along. But I can't imagine anybody wanting to further de-evolution, you might say. I don't think we have to worry about it, though, because all the evidence we've accumulated shows increasing hierarchical organization in the universe. I've never, ever entertained the thought until you raised it this very moment. All right, see you tomorrow.